I'm very conscious that one of the worst things in the world that can possibly happen to anybody is to be wrongly accused of child abuse. And one of the most important things that the safeguarding investigations have to go through is exactly what has gone on. And you all know, no doubt as well as I do, that these investigations can go on interminably. People can remain suspended for very long periods of time, and there is a risk of suicide for people who have been potentially falsely accused. Even those who have been rightly accused can also commit suicide, but I'm more concerned about those who have been wrongly accused. But any death is a tragic death. What are we going to do? How can we make sure that our systems are efficient and effective, knowing, of course, that we will be investigating some people who are innocent and deserve to be exonerated as swiftly as possible?
I think it's a very, as you say, it's a very tricky situation. However, the evidence base suggests that even where children make accusations against the wrong person, very often there is evidence of some form of abuse of the child, and that's where, you know, it's difficult. And sometimes they displace that accusation to somebody quite close, and actually, which makes it all the more terrible. I think there is still, exactly as you describe, a duty of care to the person that is accused, and at that stage nobody knows whether it's right or wrong. And depending on what process you're talking about, so are you talking about in terms of someone who is an employee?
It could be any
or a carer or somebody.
I could tell you horror stories about teachers.
Yes, well, let's take it from that example. What you have to remember is the duty of care to the employee as well, particularly at that stage, and built into our policies and procedures for accusations. And of course, there will be a very clear procedure and a designated officer to lead on that area of work. And the idea is always to conclude those as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, they are often very complex, and again, the priority always has to be the safety of the child. And due processes sometimes become involved, as you'll be aware, and that has to take time. But I think it is about having that balance between a separate process, separate set of people with responsibility for the duty of care to the person accused, regardless of what the outcome is, and the other track, which is the investigation, which also has to follow this process.
Are you suggesting that there will be Cheshire West and Chester people who will be looking after the interests of the alleged perpetrator?
There has to, if they were an employee,
yes,
there would have to be, because you would have the duty of care exactly in the way that you've described, and that would have to be, and they would have to be involved as part of the investigation. But the two things, of course, have to be kept absolutely separate. Absolutely.
I mean, one of the big issues I see is, rightly, social workers will say the interests of the child are paramount.
Yeah.
And I keep saying, paramountcy does not mean that you throw everybody else's interests out of the window.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I, for one, I'm very anxious to ensure that we do not do that.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. Paramountcy does not mean exclusivity.
Quite.
And I'll say it again, there remains that duty of care to that person, but you keep the two things separate. The process as separate, so there can be no notion of collaboration, contamination of the two things. Somebody who's out of it, who has a duty to look after maybe somebody in a HR function who carries out that role. But it is a very difficult situation, and nobody would seek to say otherwise.
Ian, if you can join in this bit, I've seen situations where people have been suspended from work. It doesn't necessarily have to be a local authority work. It could be, for example, a care home setting. And of course, the burden of paying for that person to be suspended lies on either an education budget or the private sector, whoever else. And I sometimes come across circumstances where I keep thinking that the safeguarding system does not seem to be noting the fact that there's a budget being spent extraordinarily, that time is passing, and everybody's caught in limbo, waiting to see what happens. And I spoke at an Action on Elder Abuse conference recently, and I asked the question, it was mostly local authority people that were there, so how many of you have been trained in employment law? And 10% of people put their hands up. I asked them how many of them had been trained in natural justice. None of them put their hands up. Gentlemen, can you assure me that our people will be trained in employment law and will be trained in the interest of natural justice and being fair to everybody?
I think what I would say to that is that, first of all, if you're not, It comes back to something I wrote down before actually when we were talking about it, a culture where it's okay to bring bad news. It's equally okay to say to your manager, I don't know about this. This is a difficult situation. I need help with it. We've got this situation of somebody here and this situation of somebody here. And I think that's the culture that we need to create, not a culture where people are afraid to bring bad news and therefore sit on it until actually it becomes too big a thing. And yes, of course, you would always want to conduct these things with natural justice, and that's always the aim. We know the complexity of these things sometimes gets in the way, and sometimes it is due process that makes these things. But actually, in the interest of the victim, perceived victim or otherwise, speed is always the most appropriate thing to bring a closure to some of that. So there's an imperative to do things properly with as great a speed as possible for all parties concerned. Otherwise it becomes more difficult.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, one of the things I come across repeatedly with local authorities across the country is the failure to provide agenda for meetings, the failure to provide minutes on a timely basis for people who are involved in these safeguarding investigations. And to me, this is Janet and John do local government. This is not Janet and John do safeguarding. This is the fundamental issues where people fall down.
That's poor practice.
Yes.
There's no question. That is just poor practice. And that's precisely the sort of management standards that we would need to address, but particularly in these procedures, that's very poor practice.
Oh, absolutely. I'm delighted with what I'm hearing here, guys. I mean, it's music to my ears. But I'm just going to push you a bit further. These safeguarding meetings, again, trouble me deeply because I think they're the best we're going to have, and it's what the guidance and the law basically says we're going to have. But there is a danger of creating a Salem witchcraft trial situation where you have every agency under the sun sitting around the table, and somebody will say, well, actually, I've got a problem with them. Let's take an elderly person situation. I've got a problem with tissue viability. And then you come around the table to see Sky and say, well, actually, they're only marked as adequate. And you keep going around and say, well, actually, there was a complaint 3 weeks last Tuesday. And by the time you've gone around the table, we're thinking we're dealing with the devil incarnate, but sometimes people don't take a step back and say, actually, yes, there are issues, but frankly, they're all trivial. Trivial plus trivial still equals trivial. It doesn't equal serious. So how are we going to ensure that we keep balance and proportion in our system?
I mean, I'll give you a real-life example where I think that I can help with this. Only earlier this week I was dealing with a case where I was actually reviewing the minutes of a meeting in respect of a partner employee, and I felt uncomfortable reading these minutes, but actually thought to myself, am I doing exactly what you've just described, partly to do with the climate that we're in, partly to... and actually gave it to somebody in the independent quality assurance safeguarding unit for a second view, and they came back to me and said, yes, you are, you're reading too much into this. My view is this has happened, trivial, 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 it needed to be noted, process has happened, it still amounts to actually quite a low level issue here, and the recommendations are appropriate. And again, it's the culture we need to create, because you're right, it can be very easy. Of course, good sharing and good summing up and reminding people of actually the duties, not getting caught up in that discourse of blame or this notion that you're constantly adding things. Actually, what you're often saying from different agencies is the same thing. You're just bringing a different perspective to it. What you have to watch is actually, is this stacking up, or is this just staying at this level with lots of different perspectives on it? And again, that's about skillful training in terms of chairing those meetings, looking for the analysis and the evidence, and being careful about that, but erring always on the side of making sure the most vulnerable party is safe. Sorry.
No, I was absolutely going to come in. You've just made the point. I think it comes back, I totally agree with what John said, it comes back, Chair, to some of the things that were mentioned earlier when we were talking about this, what is the social work task, I think, and who can do it, and how will they be equipped to do it. And I think the kind of challenges that you're putting down, Chair, do relate to both at the practitioner level and at the middle manager, first line manager level. The ability to have analytical skills, in other words, the ability to separate the wheat from the chaff,